In this video, we are going to discuss what your book calls perfect participles deponent. It covers them in the Grammar for 3B on page 158. I myself am going to call these participles perfect deponent participles or deponent perfect participles just because I'm more comfortable with using those terms because they were what I was taught myself years ago. Let's start with the question, what is a participle? A participle is simply an adjective made from a verb. English can make two sorts of participles from most verbs. Here's an example. From the English verb break, we get the participles breaking and broken. We can say the broken window, where broken is an adjective describing the noun window, but it's also made from the verb break, therefore it's a participle. Here we have my breaking heart. Breaking heart, once again, is describing a noun, here the word heart, so it's an adjective. But it's made from a verb, and consequently it's a participle, excuse me. It's a participle. So English has two participles that it generally uses, and most verbs, if not all verbs, probably all verbs can actually form them. Latin verbs have several participles, and we're about to meet our first. It's the perfect deponent participle. It's really easy to form. If you remove the sum from the last principal part of a deponent verb, the result is a deponent perfect participle. Here's an example. For the verb minor, minari, minatus sum, if we remove the word sum from this last principal part, we get the form minatus. And it turns out that minatus is a participle. And written out fully, it's minatus, minata, minatum, because it's actually an adjective of the first and second declension, just like multus, multum, multum. This is really just its masculine form here. Here's another example. From the verb ingredior, ingredi, ingressus sum, we get the participle ingressas a These words are adjectives and they decline just like multus, multum, multum. But how do we translate these perfect deponent participles? Well, the most accurate translation is having exed. So for the participle minatus, minata, minatum, from minor to threaten, minatus, minata, minatum means having threatened. Ingressa, ingressum, from the verb ingredior, ingredi, ingressus sum, means having entered. There's an important little issue here. These are perfect participles. They're perfect participles. In Latin, that means that their actions have to be perfect, that is, complete, before the time of the clause's main verb. You probably don't understand what I'm trying to tell you right away, but I think you'll eventually get this idea. And this is a little side note here, a little digression, which treats an important issue. It turns out that Latin is obsessed with distinguishing between actions that are complete, that is, perfect, or incomplete, with respect to the present moment, that is now, or with respect to other verbs. This is an obsession that English does not share. And the result is going to be that sometimes literally translating Latin forms leads to awkward English. But let's look at a participle in action. The first thing to realize is that participles are adjectives. Therefore, they have to be describing something with gender, number, and case. In this sentence, Marcus in aeris ingressus filium castigavit, ingressus, meaning having entered, is describing Marcus. Therefore, it has to have the same gender and number as Marcus. Here it is masculine, nominative, singular. And by the way, the word castigavit means castigate or scold. So this means Marcus, having entered into the house, castigated his son. I'm using the having ex translation to make it clear that the action of the participle in Latin is perfect, that is complete with respect to the main verb castigavit. So by using the translation having entered, I'm making it clear that this is a perfect participle, that the action of entering is complete with respect to the scolding. First, Marcus entered, and only afterwards did he castigate his son. Going back to the sentence, though, the following translation is also good English translation. Marcus, entering into the house, castigated his son. For the time being, I prefer you to translate these participles as having exed because it makes clear that this action has to come before this action. And there's a little problem. Latin actually has a participle that literally means entering into the house, and it's for actions that are incomplete with respect to the main verb. So if you said literally Marcus entering into the house in Latin with the Latin participle that corresponds to entering, he would have to be entering at the same time he castigated his son. But clearly, first he enters, then he castigates his son. Therefore, Latin must use the perfect participle. It has to use the form ingressus. By the way, this Latin obsession with whether actions are complete, that is perfect or incomplete, explains why the perfect of deponent verbs uses the present tense of sum. You may remember that ingressus sum means I entered or I have entered. It's actually a past tense. It's technically the perfect tense in Latin. The reason that works is the action of ingressus, of this perfect participle, must be complete, perfect with respect to the conjugative verb sum. So that means that it must be a perfect action. In other words, ingressus must happen before sum. Sum is present, so that means the action of ingressus had to have occurred in the past. And therefore, ingressus sum indicates a past action. Let's look at one more example of perfect deponent participle. Here we have Julia filiam conspicata in aedis ingressa est. Julia, having spotted her son, entered into the house. Now, of course, I'm going to translate this as having spotted because the action of the conspicata here, conspicata, has to be before the action of the ingressa est, the main verb. But really, in English, we would probably really just say Julia, spotting her son, entered into the house. Latin actually does have a participle that translates spotting, and if you used that participle in this sentence in Latin, what that would mean, though, is the spotting occurs at the same time as the entering. And the Latin makes it clear that that's not so. Conspicata has to be complete. It has to be perfect with respect to the main verb. Just one little word of caution here. This is an odd one. Ingressus sum means I entered. Ingressus means having entered. In my experience teaching this class, students sometimes get these two confused. In order for this word ingressus to render a full verb like I entered, okay, it has to have the verb sum with it in some way. Ingressus on its own cannot mean I entered. Ingressus can only mean having entered. So watch out. Keep track of whether the word ingressus or other participles from deponent verbs have a form of the verb to be with them or not. If they have a form of the verb to be with them, then they are complete verb forms. They're full verbs that can be the main verb of a sentence. But if they do not have a form of the word sum, they are not complete verbs. They cannot on their own form the main verb of a sentence. Here's one more example. Adipiscor, adipisci, adeptus sum. That means to get, gain, or acquire. Adepti summus means we got. Adeptus means having gotten. And these are very different things. So be very careful to note whether the perfect participle deponent has a form of the verb to be with it or not, or I should say sum with it or not. Because if it does, it's a full verb. If it doesn't, it's just a participle. It's not a complete verb form. The end. This has been a Barking Blue Heeler production.